In this video, we are going to learn about cerebellum. Our learning objectives include describe the physiological anatomy of the cerebellum, describe the neuronal or functional unit of the cerebellum, list the afferent and afferent connections of the cerebellum, then list tests of cerebellar function and describe its clinical disorders. So, when we try to learn about this topic, we will be learning some major terms associated with this topic like dysarthria, inability to speak clearly with problems with speech articulation. Then dysdiadochokinesia, inability to perform rapid alternative movements. Then dysmetria, inability to judge distance or range of movement. The Purkinje cell are among the most distinctive neurons in the brain because of the dense but flattened shape of their dendritic tree. So, what is cerebellum and its motor functions? Aside from the areas in the cerebral cortex that stimulate muscle contraction, two other brain structures are also essential for normal motor function: the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Neither of the structures can control muscle function by itself. Instead, the structures always function in association with other systems of motor control. The cerebellum plays major roles in the timing of motor activities and in rapid, smooth progression from one muscle movement to next. It also helps control the intensity of muscle contraction when the muscle load changes and controls the necessary instantaneous interplay between agonist and antagonist muscle groups. So, in cerebellum, illustrated in this figure, has long been called the silent area of the brain, principally because electrical excitation of the cerebellum does not cause any conscious sensation and rarely cause any motor movement. Removal of the cerebellum, however, causes body movements to become highly abnormal. The cerebellum is especially vital during rapid muscular activities such as running, typing, playing the piano, and even talking. Loss of this area of the brain can cause almost total lack of coordination of these activities, even though its loss does not cause paralysis of any muscles. How is it that the cerebellum can be so important when it has no direct ability to cause muscle contraction? The answer is that it helps sequence the motor activities and also monitors and makes corrective adjustments in the body's motor activities while they are being executed so that they will conform to the motor signals directed by the cerebral motor cortex and other parts of the brain. So the cerebellum receives continuously updated information about the desired sequence of muscle contractions from the brain motor control areas. It also receives continuous sensory information from the peripheral parts of the body, giving sequential changes in the status of each part of the body, its position, rate of movement, forces acting on it, and so forth. The cerebellum then compares the actual movements as depicted by the peripheral sensory feedback information with the movements intended by the motor system. If the two do not compare favorably, then instantaneous subconscious connective signals are transmitted back into the motor system to increase or decrease the levels of activation of specific muscles. The cerebellum also aids the cerebral cortex in planning the next sequential movement a fraction of a second in advance of the current movement which is still being executed, thus helping the person to progress smoothly from one movement to the next. Also, it learns by its mistake, that is, if a movement does not occur exactly as intended, the cerebellar circuit learns to make a stronger or weaker movement the next time. To make this adjustment, changes occur in the excitability of appropriate cerebellar neurons, thus bringing subsequent muscle contractions into better correspondence with the intended movements. Then, anatomical and functional areas of the cerebellum. Anatomically, the cerebellum is divided into three lobes by two deep fissures as shown in the figure: anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. The flocculonodular lobe is the oldest of all portions of the cerebellum. It developed along with and functions with the vestibular system in controlling body equilibrium. So in this picture, we could see regions which are called as posterior lobe is there, anterior lobe is there, pons region, medulla region, then flocculonodular lobe region. These are the anatomical lobes of the cerebellum as seen from the lateral side. So which are the flocculonodular lobe is there, anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and some other regions which we know that, like pons and medulla regions. Longitudinal functional divisions of the anterior and posterior lobes. From a functional point of view, the anterior and posterior lobes are organized not by loops but along the longitudinal axis, as demonstrated by this figure, which shows a posterior view of the human cerebellum after the lower end of the posterior cerebellum has been rolled downward from its normally hidden position. Now down the center of the cerebellum, a narrow band called the vermis, which is separated from the remainder of the cerebellum by shallow grooves. Most cerebellar control functions for muscle movement of the axial body, neck, shoulders, and hips are located in this area. To each side of the vermis is a large laterally protruding cerebral hemisphere, and each of these hemispheres is divided into an intermediate zone and a lateral zone. The intermediate zone of the hemisphere is concerned with controlling muscle contractions in the distal portions of the upper and lower limbs, especially the hands, fingers, feet, and toes. The lateral zone of the hemisphere operates at a much more remote level because this area joins with the cerebral cortex in the overall planning of sequential motor movements. Without this lateral zone, most discrete motor activities of the body lose their appropriate timing and sequencing and therefore become uncoordinated. In this figure, we could see regions like vermis region, anterior lobe is there, hemisphere region, and posterior lobe is there. And a part which we already learned like flocculonodular lobe, then vermis region, the lateral zone of hemisphere, intermediate zone of hemisphere. These are the functional parts of the cerebellum as seen from the posterior inferior view, with the inferior most portion of the cerebellum rolled upward or outward to flatten the surface. Then topographical representation of the body in the vermis and intermediate zones in the same manner that the cerebral sensory cortex, motor cortex, basal ganglia, red nuclei, and reticular formation all have topographical representations of the different parts of the body. So does the vermis and intermediate zones of the cerebellum. Next figure shows two such representations. Note that the axial portions of the body lie in the vermis part of the cerebellum, whereas the limbs and facial regions lie in the intermediate zones. These topographical representations receive afferent nerve signals from all the respective parts of the body as well as from corresponding topographical motor areas of cerebral cortex and brainstem. In turn, they send motor signals back to the same respective topographical areas of the cerebral motor cortex as well as to topographical areas of the red nucleus and reticular formation of the brainstem. So this figure shows somatosensory projection areas in the cerebellar cortex. Note that the large lateral portions of the cerebellar hemisphere do not have topographical representations of the body. These areas of the cerebellum receive input signals almost exclusively from the cerebral cortex, especially the promoter areas of the frontal cortex and from the somatosensory and other sensory association areas of the parietal cortex. It is believed that this connectivity with the cerebral cortex allows the lateral portions of the cerebellar hemisphere to play important roles in planning and coordinating the body's rapid sequential muscular activities that occur one after another within fractions of a second. Then next topic, neuronal circuit of the cerebellum. The human cerebellar cortex is actually a large folded sheet about 17 centimeter wide by 120 centimeter long with the folds lying crosswise as shown in this figure and also like this one. Each fold is called a folium. Lying deep beneath the folded mass of cerebellar cortex are deep cerebellar nuclei. The next topic, input pathways to the cerebellum, afferent pathways from other parts of the brain. The basic input pathways of the cerebellum are shown with the help of this figure. An extensive and important afferent pathway is the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway, which originates in the cerebellar motor and premotor corticals and also in the cerebral somatosensory cortex. It passes by way of the pontile nuclei and pontocerebellar tracts, mainly to the lateral divisions of the cerebellar hemispheres on the opposite side of the brain from the cerebral areas. In addition, important afferent tracts originate in each side of the brainstem. These tracts include an extensive olivocerebellar tract, which passes from the inferior olive to all parts of the cerebellum and is excited in the olive by fibers from the cerebral motor cortex, basal ganglia, widespread areas of the reticular formation and spinal cord. Then two vestibulocerebellar fibers, some of which originate in the vestibular apparatus itself and others from the brainstem vestibular nuclei, with almost all of these fibers terminating in the flocculonodular lobe and fastigial nucleus of the cerebellum. Then third part, like reticulocerebellar fibers, which originate in the different portions of the brainstem reticular formation and terminate in the midline cerebellar areas, mainly in the vermis. Then afferent pathways from the periphery. The cerebellum also receives important sensory signals directly from the peripheral parts of the body, mainly through 4 tracts on each side, 2 of which are located dorsally in the cord and 2 ventrally. The 2 most important of these tracts are shown with the help of next figure, this figure. No, next one. This one. The dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the ventral spinocerebellar tract. The dorsal tract enters the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and terminates in the vermis and intermediate zones of the cerebellum on the same side as its origin. The ventral tract enters the cerebellum through the superior cerebral peduncle, but it terminates on both sides of the cerebellum. Before learning about that, let's look at this picture. Principal afferent tracts to the cerebellum. Here we could see regions like posterior lobe is there, flocculonodular lobe, then anterior lobe, superior cerebellar peduncle, then ventral spinocerebellar tract, along with that cerebropontine tract, then pontocerebellar tract, then middle cerebellar peduncle, then vestibulocerebellar tract, then olivocerebellar and reticulocerebellar tract, along with that inferior cerebellar peduncle, then ventral spinocerebellar tract, along with that dorsal spinocerebellar tract. These are the different principal afferent tracts to the cerebellum. The next figure, spinocerebellar tracts. The signals transmitted in the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts come mainly from the muscle spindles and to a lesser extent from other somatic receptors throughout the body, such as Golgi tendon organs, large tactile receptors of the skin, and joint receptors. All the signals apprise the cerebellum of the momentary status of muscle contraction, then degree of tension on the muscle tendons, and position and rates of movement of the parts of the body, and forces acting on the surface of the body. Then the ventral spinocerebellar tracts receive much less information from the peripheral receptors. Instead, they are excited mainly by motor signals arriving in the anterior horns of the spinal cord from the brain through the corticospinal and rubrospinal tracts, and then internal motor pattern generators in the cord itself. This ventral fiber pathway tells the cerebellum which motor signals have arrived at the anterior horns. This feedback is called the efferentoscopy of the anterior horn motor drive. Then the spinocerebellar pathway can transmit impulses at velocities up to 120 meter per second, which is the most rapid conduction in any pathway in the central nervous system. The speed is important for instantaneous appraisal of the cerebellum of changes in peripheral muscle actions. In addition to signals from this spinocerebellar tract, signals are transmitted into the cerebellum from the body periphery through the spinal dorsal columns to the dorsal column nuclei of the medulla and are then relayed to the cerebellum. So likewise, signals are transmitted up the spinal cord through the spino-reticular pathway to the reticular formation of the brainstem, and also through the spino-olivary pathway to the inferior olivary nucleus. Signals are then relayed from both of these areas to the cerebellum. Thus, the cerebellum continually collects information about the movements and positions of all parts of the body, even though it is operating at a subconscious level. Then output signals from the cerebellum, deep cerebellar nuclei and efferent pathways. Located deep in the cerebellar mass, on each side are three deep cerebellar nuclei: the dentate, interpost, and fastigial. The vestibular nuclei in the medulla also function in some respects as if they were deep cerebellar nuclei because of their direct connections with the cortex of the flocculonodular lobe. All the deep cerebellar nuclei receive signals from two sources like cerebellar cortex and deep sensory afferent tracts to the cerebellum. Each time an input signal arrives in the cerebellum, it divides and goes in two directions, like directly to one of the cerebellar deep nuclei, then another one to corresponding area of the cerebellar cortex overlaying the deep nucleus. Then a fraction of a second later, the cerebellar cortex relays an inhibitory output signal to the deep nucleus. Thus, all input signals that enter the cerebellum eventually end in deep nuclei in the form of initial excitatory signals, following a fraction of a second later by inhibitory signals. From a deep nuclei, output signals leave the cerebellum and are distributed to other parts of the brain. The general plan of the major efferent pathways leading out of the cerebellum is shown with the help of this figure and consists of the following pathways: a pathway that originates in the midline structure of the cerebellum, the vermis region, and then passes through the fastigial nuclei into the medullary and pontile regions of the brainstem. The circuit functions in close association with the equilibrium apparatus and brainstem vestibular nuclei to control equilibrium, as well as in association with the reticular formation of the brainstem to control the postural attitudes of the body. So this figure shows principal afferent tracts from the cerebellum, like dentate nucleus is there, cerebello thalamocortical tract, then a reticulum of mesencephalon, some regions to thalamus, red nucleus is there, superior cerebellar peduncle, then fastigial nucleus, fastigioreticular tract, paleocerebellum. A pathway that originates in an intermediate zone of the cerebellar hemisphere and then passes through the interpost nucleus to the ventrolateral and ventro-anterior nuclei of the thalamus, and then to the cerebral cortex, and later to several midline structures of the thalamus, and then to the basal ganglia, and along with that the red nucleus and reticular formation of the upper portion of the brainstem. This complex circuit mainly helps coordinate the reciprocal contractions of agonist and antagonist muscles in the peripheral portions of the limbs, especially in hands, fingers, and thumbs. A pathway that begins in the cerebellar cortex of the lateral zone of the cerebellar hemisphere and then passes to the dentate nucleus next to the ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei of the thalamus, and finally to the cerebral cortex. This pathway plays an important role in helping coordinate sequential motor activities initiated by the cerebral cortex. Now, functional unit of the cerebellar cortex, the Purkinje and deep nuclear cells. The cerebellum is about 30 million nearly identical functional units, one of which is shown in the left in this figure. This one in the left side. This functional unit centers on a single very large Purkinje cell and on corresponding deep nuclear cell. To the top and right in this figure, the three major layers of the cerebellar cortex are shown, like molecular layer is there, Purkinje cell layer, and granule cell layer. Beneath these cortical layers in the center of the cerebellar mass are the deep cerebral nuclei that send output signals to other parts of the nerve system. The neuronal circuit of the functional unit, also shown in the left half of this figure, is the neuronal circuit of the functional unit, which is repeated with little variation 30 million times in the cerebellum. The output of the functional unit is from a deep nuclear cell. The cell is continuously under both excitatory and inhibitory influences. The excitatory influence arises from direct connections with afferent fibers that enter the cerebellum and from the brain or the periphery. The inhibitory influence arises entirely from the Purkinje cell in the cortex of the cerebellum. In this figure, we could see regions like Purkinje cell is there, climbing fiber, deep nuclear cell, along with that input inferior olive, then inhibitory input from Purkinje cells, then excitatory afferent inputs from climbing fibers and Morse fibers, then granule cells, Morse fiber, then molecular layer, Purkinje cell layer, granule cell layer, deep nuclei input, all other afferents. Then cortex. Deep nuclear cells receive excitatory and inhibitory inputs. The left side of this figure shows the basic neuronal circuit of the cerebellum with the excitatory neurons shown in red and the Purkinje cell and inhibitory neurons shown in black. To the right is shown the physical relationship of the deep cerebellar nuclei to the cerebellar cortex with its three layers. The afferent inputs to the cerebellum are mainly of two types, one called the climbing fiber type and other called the Morse fiber type. The climbing fiber all originate from the inferior olives of the medulla. There is one climbing fiber for about 5 to 10 Purkinje cells after sending branches to several deep nuclear cells. The climbing fiber continues all the way to the outer layers of the cerebellar cortex, where it makes about 300 synapses with the soma and dendrites of each Purkinje cell. This climbing fiber is distinguished by the fact that a single impulse in it will always cause a single prolonged up to 1 second particular type of action potential in each Purkinje cell with which it connects, beginning with a strong spike and followed by a trail of weakening secondary spike. This action potential is called the complex spike. The Morse fibers are all the other fibers that enter the cerebellum from multiple sources like the higher brain, brain stem, and spinal cord. These fibers also send collaterals to excite the deep nuclear cells. They then process to the granule cell layer of the cortex, where they also synapse with hundreds to thousands of granule cells. In turn, the granule cells send extremely small axons less than 1 μm in diameter up to the molecular layer on the outer surface of the cerebellar cortex. Here the axons divide into two branches that extend 1 to 2 mm in each direction parallel to the fovea. Many millions of these parallel nerve fibers exist because there are some 5,000 to 1 500 to 1000 granule cells for every one Purkinje cell. It is into this molecular layer that the dendrites of the Purkinje cells project, and 80,000 to 2 lakh 200,000 of the parallel fibers synapse with each Purkinje cell. The Morse fiber input to the Purkinje cell is quite different from the climbing fiber input because the synaptic connections are weak. So large numbers of Morse fibers must be stimulated simultaneously to excite the Purkinje cell. Furthermore, activation usually takes the form of a much weaker short duration Purkinje cell action potential called the simple spike rather than the prolonged complex action potential caused by climbing fiber input. Other inhibitory cells in the cerebellum. In addition to the deep nuclear cells, granule cells and Purkinje cells, two other types of neurons are located in the cerebellum like basket cells and stellate cells. These are inhibitory cells with short axons. Both the basket cells and stellate cells are located in the molecular layer of the cerebellar cortex lying among and stimulated by the small parallel fibers. The cells in turn send their axons at right angles across the parallel fibers and cause lateral inhibition of adjacent Purkinje cells, thus sharpening the signal in the same manner that lateral inhibition sharpens contrast of signals in many other neuronal circuit of the nerve system. Then function of the cerebellum in overall motor control. The central nervous system uses the cerebellum to coordinate motor control functions at three levels, like the vestibulocerebellum. This level consists principally of the small flocculonodular cerebellar lobes that lie under the posterior cerebellum and adjacent portions of the vermis. It provides neural circuits for most of the body's equilibrium movements. Then the spinocerebellum. This level consists of most of the vermis of the posterior and anterior cerebral plus the adjacent intermediate zones on both sides of the vermis. It provides a circuitry for coordinating many movements of the distal portions of the limbs, especially the limbs and hands and fingers. Then the cerebrocerebellum. This level consists of the large lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere lateral to the intermediate zones. It receives usually all its input from the cerebellar motor cortex and adjacent promoter and somatosensory corticals of the cerebellum. It transmits its output information in the upward direction back to the brain, functioning in a feedback manner with the cerebral cortical sensory motor system to plan sequential voluntary body and limb movements. These movements are planned as much as tenths of a second in advance of the actual movements. This process is called development of motor imagery of movements to be performed. Then the vestibulocerebellum functions in association with the brainstem and spinal cord to control equilibrium and postural movements. The vestibulocerebellum originated phylogenetically at about the same time that the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear developed. Furthermore, loss of the flocculonodular lobes and adjacent portions of the vermis of cerebellum, which constitute the vestibulocerebellum, cause extreme disturbance of equilibrium and postural movements. In people with vestibulocerebellar dysfunction, equilibrium is far more disturbed during performance of rapid motions than during stasis, especially when these movements involve changes in direction of movement and stimulate the semicircular ducts. This phenomenon suggests that the vestibulocerebellum is important in controlling balance between agonist and antagonist muscle contractions of the spine, hips, and shoulders during rapid changes in body positions as required by the vestibular apparatus. One of the major problems in controlling balance is the amount of time required to transmit position signals and velocity of movement signals from the different parts of the body to the brain. Even when the most rapidly conducting sensory pathways are used up to 120 meter per second in the spinocerebellar afferent tracts, the delay for transmission from the feet to the brain is still 15 to 20 milliseconds. The feet of a person running rapidly can move as much as 10 in during that time. Inch. Therefore, it is never possible for return signals from the peripheral parts of the body to reach the brain at the same time that the movements actually occur. How then it is possible for the brain to know when to stop a movement and to perform the next sequential act when the movements are performed rapidly? The answer is that the signals from the periphery tell the brain how rapidly and in which directions the the body parts are moving. It is then the function of the vestibulocerebellum to calculate in advance from the states and directions where the different parts will be during the next few milliseconds. The results of these calculations are the key to the brain's progression to the next sequential movement. Thus, during control of equilibrium, it is presumed that information from both the body periphery and the vestibular apparatus is used in typical feedback control circuit to provide anticipatory correction of postural motor signals necessary for maintaining equilibrium even during extremely rapid motion, including rapidly changing directions of motion. Then spinocerebellum, feedback control of distal limb movements by way of intermediate cerebellar cortex and the interpost nucleus. So, spinocerebellum, feedback control of distal limb movements by way of the intermediate cerebellar cortex and the interpost nucleus. As shown in this figure, the intermediate zone of each cerebellar hemisphere receives two types of information when a movement is performed: information from the cerebral motor cortex and from the midbrain red nucleus, telling the cerebellum the intended sequential plan of movement for the next few fractions of a second, and feedback information from the peripheral parts of the body, especially from the distal proprioceptors of the limbs, telling the cerebellum that actual movement result. So, cerebral and cerebellar control of voluntary movements involving especially the intermediate zone of cerebellum. We could see this picture. Like motor cortex is the thalamus, red nucleus, intermediate zone of cerebellum, mesencephalan pons and medulla regions, corticospinal tract, then spinocerebellar tract, then reticulospinal and rubbospinal tracts. After the intermediate zone of the cerebellum has compared the intended movements with the actual movement, the deep nuclear cells of the interposted nucleus send corrective output signals back to the cerebral motor cortex through relay nuclei in the thalamus and to the magnocellular portion, the lower portion of the red nucleus that gives rise to the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract in turn joins the corticospinal tract in innervating the lateral most motor neurons in the anterior horns of the spinal cord gray matter, the neurons that control the distal parts of the limbs, particularly the hands and fingers. This part of the cerebellar motor control system provides smooth coordinated movements of the agonist and antagonist muscles of the distal limbs for performing acute, purposeful patterned movements. The cerebellum seems to compare the intentions of the higher levels of the motor control system as transmitted to the intermediate cerebellar zone through the corticopontocerebellar tract with the performance by the respective parts of the body as transmitted back to the cerebellum from the periphery. In fact, the ventral spinocerebellar tract even transmits back to the cerebellum an efference copy of the actual motor control signals that reach the anterior motor neurons, and this information is also integrated with the signals arriving from the muscle spindle and other proprioception related sensory organs, permitting principally in the transmitted principally in the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Similar comparator signals also go to the inferior olivary complex. If the signals do not compare favorably, the olivary Purkinje cell system, along with possible other cerebral learning mechanisms, eventually corrects the motions until they perform the desired functions. Then, function of the cerebellum to prevent overshoot and to dam movements. Almost all movements of the body are pendular. For instance, when an arm is moved, momentum develops, and the momentum must be overcome before the movement can be stopped. Because of momentum, all pendular moments have a tendency to overshoot. If overshooting occurs in a person whose cerebellum has been destroyed, the conscious centers of the cerebrum eventually recognize this occurrence and initiate a movement in reverse direction to attempt to bring the arm to its intended position. However, the arm, by virtue of its momentum, overshoots once more in the opposite direction, and appropriate corrective signals must again be instituted. Thus, the arm oscillates back and forth past its intended point for several cycles before it finally fixes on its mark. This effect is called the action tremor or inattention tremor. If the cerebellum is intact, appropriate learned subconscious signals stop the movement precisely at the intended point, thereby preventing the overshoot and tremor. This activity is the basic characteristic of a damping system. All control systems regulating pendular elements that have inertia must have damping circuits built into the mechanisms. For motor control by the nerve system, the cerebellum provides most of this damping function. Then cerebellar control of ballistic movements. Most rapid movements of the body, such as the movement of the fingers in typing, occur so rapidly that it is not possible to receive feedback information either from the periphery to the cerebellum or from the cerebellum back to the motor cortex before the movements are over. These movements are called ballistic movements, meaning that the entire movement is pre planned and set into motion to go a specific distance and then to stop. Another important example is the saccadic movements of the eyes, in which the eyes jump from one position to the next when reading or when looking at successive points along a road as a person is moving in a car. Much can be understood about the function of the cerebellum by studying the changes that occur in these ballistic movements. When the cerebellum is removed, three major changes occur. The movements are slow to develop and do not have the extra onset surge that cerebellum usually provides. The force developed is weak, and the movements are slow to turn off, usually allowing the movement to go well beyond the intended mark. Therefore, in the absence of the cerebellar circuit, the motor cortex has to think extra hard to turn ballistic movements on and again has to think hard and take extra time to turn the movement off. Thus, the automatism of ballistic movement is lost. Considering once again the circuitry of the cerebellum, one sees that it is beautifully organized to perform this biphasic first excitatory and then delayed inhibitory function that is required for pre-planned rapid ballistic movements. Also, the built-in timing circuits of the cerebellar cortex are fundamental to this particular ability of the cerebellum. Then, cerebrocerebellum functions of the large lateral zone of the cerebellar hemisphere to plan, sequence, and time complex movements. In human beings, the lateral zones of the two cerebellar hemispheres are highly developed and greatly enlarged. This characteristics goes along with human abilities to plan and perform intricate sequential patterns of movement, especially with the hands and fingers, and to speak. Yet the large lateral zones of the cerebellar hemispheres have no direct input of information from the peripheral parts of the body. In addition, almost all communication between these lateral cerebellar areas and the cerebral cortex is not with the primary cerebral motor cortex but instead with the promoter area and primary and association somatosensory areas. Even so, destruction of the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere along with their deep nuclei, the dentate nuclei, can lead to extreme incoordination of complex purposeful movements of the hands, fingers, and feet, and of the speech apparatus. This condition has been difficult to understand because of lack of direct communication between this part of the cerebellum and the primary motor cortex. However, experimental studies suggest that these portions of the cerebellum are concerned with two other important but indirect aspects of motor control, like the planning of sequential movements and the timing of sequential movements. The next topic, planning of sequential movements. The planning of sequential movements require that the lateral zones of the hemispheres communicate with both the promoter and sensory portions of the cerebral cortex, and it requires two-way communication between the cerebral cortex areas with corresponding areas of the basal ganglia. It seems that the plan of sequential movements actually begins in the sensory and promoter areas of the cerebral cortex, and from there, the plan is transmitted to the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere. Then, amid much two-way traffic between the cerebellum and cerebral cortex, appropriate motor signals provide transition from one sequence of movement to the next. An interesting observation that supports this view is that many neurons in the cerebellar dentate nuclei display the activity pattern for the sequential movement that is yet to come, while the present movement is still occurring. Thus, the lateral cerebellar zones appear to be involved not with what movement is happening at a given moment, but what will be happening during the next sequential movement, a fraction of a second or perhaps even seconds later. To summarize, one of the most important features of normal motor function is one's ability to progress smoothly from one movement to the next in orderly succession. In the absence of the large lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere, this capability is seriously disturbed or disturbed for rapid movements. And then timing function for sequential movements. Another important function of the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere is to provide appropriate timing for each succeeding movement. In the absence of the cerebellar zones, one loses the subconscious ability to predict how far the different parts of the body will move in a given time. Without this timing capability, the person becomes unable to determine when the next sequential movement needs to begin. As a result, the succeeding movement may begin too early or more likely too late. Therefore, lesions in the lateral zones of the cerebellum causes complex movements like those required for writing, running, or even talking to more incoordinate lacking ability to progress in orderly sequence from one moment to the next. Such cerebellar lesions are said to cause failure of smooth progression of movement. Then next topic, summary of integrated functions of the cerebellum. The cerebellum functions with all levels of muscle control. It functions with the spinal cord especially to enhance the stretch reflex. So when a contracting muscle encounters an unexpectedly heavy load, a long stretch reflex signal transmitted all the way through the cerebellum and back again to the cord strongly enhances the load resisting effect of the basic stretch reflex. Then at the brainstem level, the cerebellum functions to make the postural movements of the body, especially the rapid movements required by the equilibrium system, smooth and continuous and without abnormal oscillations. At the cerebral cortex level, the cerebellum operates in association with the cortex to provide many accessory motor functions, especially to provide extra motor force for running on muscle contraction rapidly at the start of a movement. Near the end of that movement, the cerebellum turns on antagonistic muscle at exactly the right time and with proper force to stop the movement at the intended point. Furthermore, there is a good physiological evidence that all aspects of this turn on or turn off patterning by the cerebellum can be learned with experience. The cerebellum functions at the cerebellar cortex at still another level of motor control. It helps to program in advance muscle contractions that are required for smooth progression from a present rapid movement in one direction to the next rapid movement in another direction, and with all this occurring in a fraction of a second. The neuronal circuit for this passes from the cerebral cortex to the large lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere and then back to the cerebral cortex. Then the cerebellum functions mainly when rapid muscle movements are required. Without the cerebellum, slow and calculated movements can still occur, but it is difficult for the corticospinal system to achieve rapid and changing intended movements to execute a particular goal and respect, especially to progress smoothly from one rapid movement to the next. Then clinical abnormalities of the cerebellum. Destruction of small portions of lateral cerebellar cortex seldom causes detectable abnormalities from motor function. In fact, several months after as much as one half of the lateral cerebellum cortex on one side of the brain has been removed, if the deep cerebellar nuclei are not removed along with the cortex, the motor functions of the animal appears to be almost normal as long as the animal performs all movements slowly. These remaining portions of the motor control system are capable of compensating to a great extent for loss of parts of the cerebellum. To cause serious and continuing dysfunction of the cerebellum, the cerebellar lesion usually must involve one or more of the deep cerebellar nuclei, the dentate, interpost, or fastigial nuclei. Tests of cerebellar function include the testing of coordination of movements like ataxia and the gait, inspection of for tremors, tests for tone like hypotonia, and tests for rapidly alternating movements like diadochokinesis. These are described in the following like dysmetria, and ataxia. Two of the most important symptoms for cerebellar disease are dysmetria, dysmetria and ataxia. In the absence of the cerebellum, the subconscious motor control system cannot predict how far movements will go. Therefore, the movements ordinarily overshoot their intended mark. Then the conscious portion of the brain overcompensates in the opposite direction for the succeeding compensatory movement. This effect is called dysmetria and it results in uncoordinated movements that are called ataxia. Dysmetria and ataxia can also result from lesions in the spinocerebellar tracts because feedback information from the moving parts of the body to the feedback information from the moving parts of other body parts to the cerebellum is essential for cerebellar timing of movement termination. Then past pointing. Past pointing means that in the absence of the cerebellum, a person ordinarily moves the hand or some other moving part of the body considerably beyond the point of intention. This movement results from the fact that normally the cerebellum cerebellum initiates most of the motor signal that turns off a movement after it is begun. If the cerebellum is not available to initiate this motor signal, the movement ordinarily goes beyond the intended mark. Therefore, past pointing is actually a manifestation of dysmetria. Then, failure of progression. Dysdiadochokinesia, inability to perform rapid alternative movements. When the motor control system fails to predict where the different parts of the body will be at a given time, it loses perception of the parts during rapid motor movement. As a result, the succeeding movement may begin much too early or much too late, so no orderly progression of movement can occur. One can demonstrate this effect rapidly by having a patient with cerebellar damage turn one hand upward and downward at a rapid rate. The patient rapidly loses all perception of the instantaneous position of the hand during any portion of the movement. As a result, a series of stalled attempted but jumbled movements occur instead of the normal coordinate upward and downward motions. This condition is called dysdiadochokinesia. Then dysarthria, failure of progression in talking. Another example in which failure of progression occurs in talking because of the formation of word depends on rapid and orderly succession of individual muscle movements in the larynx, mouth, and respiratory system. Lack of coordination among these structures and the inability to adjust in advance either the intensity of sound or the duration of each successive sound causes jumbled vocalization, with some syllables loud, some weak, some held for long intervals, and some held for short intervals. With resultant speech that is often unintelligible. This condition is called dysarthria. Then inattention tremor. When a person who has lost the cerebellum performs a voluntary act, the movements tend to oscillate, especially when they approach the intended mark, first overshooting their mark and then vibrating back and forth several times before settling on the mark. This reaction is called an intention tremor or an action tremor, that it results from the cerebellar overshooting and failure of the cerebellar system to dam the motor movements. Then cerebellar nystagmus, nystagmus like tremor of the eyeballs. Cerebellar nystagmus is tremor of the eyeballs that usually occur when one attempts to fixate the eyes on a scene to one side of the head. This off-center type of fixation results in rapid, tremorless movements of the eyes rather than steady fixation, and it is another manifestation of the failure of damping by the cerebellum. It occurs especially when the flocculonodular lobes of the cerebellum are damaged. In this instance, it is also associated with loss of equilibrium because of dysfunction of the pathways through the flocculonodular cerebellum from the semicircular ducts. Then hypertonia, decreased tone of the musculature. Loss of the deep cerebellar nuclei, particularly of the dentate and interpost nuclei, cause decreased tone of the peripheral body musculature on the side of the cerebellar lesion. The hypertonia results from loss of cerebellar facilitation of the motor cortex and brainstem motor nuclei by tonic signals from the deep cerebellar nuclei.